Good morning. Welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today, and we have some big news on the economy front.
That's right. Today, the Federal Reserve is expected to raise interest rates again. Reuters reports that stakes are high as Fed officials weigh the risk of a recession, a byproduct of raising interest rates too high too quickly. The hike today is expected to be 75 basis points. We have the Hill's finance reporter, Sylvan Lane, here to discuss. Welcome, Sylvan.
Thanks for having me.
Help us understand the reasoning here. With the risks associated with more interest strikes, is this the best tool that the government has at its disposal?
So it's really one of the only tools the Federal Reserve has at its disposal. Now, there's a bunch of ways that the Biden administration and Congress could try to tackle some of the forces that are driving inflation higher. You know, a lot of that has to do with the war in Ukraine and the war's impact on oil prices, food prices, Russia blocking off a lot of wheat and, by virtue of their actions, oil from reaching the market. But the Fed can't really do much about that. So their job and, to the best that they can do is to try to slow the economy enough to bring down inflation without it causing some sort of longer term economic decline. And the main way they do that is by making money harder to borrow and more expensive to get. So, it's a risky option, and it's made riskier by the fact that the Fed waited so long to use this. But they've kind of backed themselves into a corner here by waiting as long as they did to get going in the first place.
We've had a lot of debate, I suppose, in the last 24 hours or more about whether the U.S. is headed for or already in a recession, with a kind of, I think, trying to redefine the term a little bit going on with the Biden White House, with the press secretary saying, well, yes, maybe it's not strictly if you have 2 quarters of negative reverse growth. And I just saw a column from Paul Krugman kind of saying the same thing. Do you have thoughts about this kind of effort to redefine the term to maybe deny that things are as bad as they are?
Sure. So I think there's 2 things going on here. The Biden administration is focusing on this very technical definition of what a recession is that a group of economists use to determine, specifically when the U.S. is in a recession. Now, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is a think tank that makes that call, they consider things like, job growth or job losses. So the White House isn't wrong that economists technically consider a recession to be more than 2 consecutive quarters of economic growth declining. That used to be a good rule of thumb, but in this COVID world, things have been thrown so out of whack. We're still seeing pretty strong job growth, so it's not super clear that rule holds up right now. The other part of that is you can have an economy facing trouble and an economy that's not great for people without necessarily being in a recession or knowing that you're in a recession. So while the Biden administration may not be wrong to say we're not in a recession right now, we may not be in a recession right now, there's a risk of papering over some of the real problems in the economy that could eventually lead us there.
Well, just this week, Walmart actually cut its profit outlook due to inflation, as shoppers are now forced to spend more on food and gas. But some big brands aren't backing down from price increases. That includes Coca-Cola, Dove, Huggies diapers. They all said they'd have to keep costs high unless consumer spending takes a nosedive. This comes as more Americans are feeling the sting of high energy costs and are having a harder time paying bills now than when COVID hit. That's according to the U.S. Census Bureau. 4 in 10 adults said it's been difficult or somewhat difficult or very difficult to cover usual household expenses in a recent poll, implying that more than 90 million families are currently struggling under inflation.
And when asked about the impact families are having in response to the high prices on food, the White House had this to say.
Our economy is more resilient to the types of challenges that we faced. For example, with respect to food, we're a net exporter of agricultural commodities, and obviously the high prices are hitting Americans very hard, but in a way that is different from some places that are facing famine, for example.
Yeah, this is the issue. It does feel like all of the conversation about recession is a little misplaced when the argument seems to be, let's squeeze the average working people to drive down consumer spending. Let's let them feel a little bit of a recession. You know, we're causing this effect by making it more difficult for them to buy the things that they need, by making those goods more expensive, and also hand-wringing about the fact that it isn't in fact a recession. What is the distinction at a certain point if people are already feeling so overwhelmed financially and economically to be playing these kinds of semantic games?
Well, yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is we know that there are a lot of people in this country struggling right now with how high food and gas prices have gotten. The Fed is trying to do the best they can to the extent that they can to calm that down. But, this is a tough situation. And, we've talked a little bit about, the pros and cons of, you hike interest rates to slow the economy. Well, that affects the entire economy. Now, folks who see inflation as a little bit of an annoyance, higher rates aren't going to hurt them as much. But when you get into the squeeze where, rates are getting higher, but inflation may not be coming down, that hurts people who are living paycheck to paycheck, who for them, the cents at the end of the dollar figures on their receipt really do matter. For a lot of the country, that's not the case. But that's the difficulty of the situation that we're in. The White House is trying to keep people calm and keep people reassured that things are going to be going okay. There's a political interest in doing that with the midterm elections coming up. But it is also important to make sure that people don't entirely lose faith in the situation, because then it could get harder to dig out of.
Earlier, you brought up the Ukraine-Russia situation and how that is contributing to some of the economic pain Americans are feeling. And that, honestly, more than a lot of the other factors, the pandemic, supply chains, et cetera, that have helped create our present circumstance, that is something that is within the Biden administration's purview to have a different policy. We could stop sending aid. We could, press for more of a diplomatic outcome. There are various things we could do, but the Biden administration has been very clear, has said that they, want to continue and will continue and will keep sending money, supporting the Ukraine cause, really, no matter what it takes, is I think the direct line I've heard from the White House. What do you think will be the impact of that, continuing to affect the prices people are experiencing, the energy costs that undergird so much of all the other stuff?
So, yeah, I mean, as long as the war in Ukraine goes on, as long as the U.S. and European allies are committed to supporting Ukraine and, committed to actually supporting their attempts to fend off the Russian invasion of their country, we're likely going to see issues with food and energy prices continue to persist. Biden has talked a lot about this as the cost of peace and the cost of global stability. And one could make an economic argument that letting Russia run rampant through Europe is worse for the global economy and the U.S. in the long term. So that's the calculation that the administration has made. The ideal situation is that inflation across the rest of the economy comes down as we continue to deal with these price shocks, and that the Biden administration and its European allies figure out ways to shore up their supplies of food and energy that make them less reliant on Russia. But it's, pretty clear, I'm not a foreign policy guy, but it's pretty clear that we're not close to the war in Ukraine ending from what we've seen. So this is going to be something we have to kind of deal with for a while, it seems like.
That's the issue, Sylvan. There is a way that talking about these issues, when one asks a question about what can be done, there is a way that saying, well, the Fed only has these limited powers is a way to narrow the conversation artificially and not talk about the huge elephant in the room, which is one of the key factors that's driving inflation. I understand why economists might not necessarily want to weigh into the geopolitical aspect of it all, but that kind of balkanization of issues, I think, is really negatively affecting the discourse and preventing folks from realizing what they could be doing to hold the Biden administration accountable. Because very rarely, I think, in the public sphere, is the war in Ukraine treated or discussed as though it has the potential for ending. There's a lot of, I think, buy-in to the idea that we have to do this because of some Monroe Doctrine type of a thing where we are going to think Russia's going to run rampant across Europe instead of the more limited claims that were made at the beginning of this conflict. And I am worried that there's a kind of rhetorical escalation or a rhetorical kind of acceptance of the status quo that is basically wiping off 50% or more of what could be resolving the solutions that could be resolving the current economic crisis from even being discussed.
Certainly, the war in Ukraine is obviously it's a incredibly difficult situation. Any way you look at it, it's going to be an economic issue for a while. The way that the Biden administration has tried to handle it economically, at least, has been, trying, at first it was a lot of, this is Putin's price hike. And then eventually it's like, okay, well, if it's Putin's price hike, what are you going to do about it? And we've seen the Biden administration try to take some action on that front. Yesterday, they announced that they were going to take some measures that would give oil producers a guarantee for a certain price floor. So if they boost production, they're not going to all of a sudden lose money. If you're concerned about climate change and what oil companies have done, you may not be happy about that. But this is a way that the Biden administration is trying to, put a cap on energy prices to the extent that they can, because as you noted, this, the war in Ukraine, there's a lot of different factors pushing that and a lot of different factors complicating whether or not the Biden administration can navigate around that as it tries to fight inflation as well.
Well, Sylvan Lane, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
And we'll be back next with Briahna's Radar. Stick around.